Well, thank you very much, Ralph. It is great to be with you all. Thank you all for coming out and supporting my good friend Ralph, who is serving as one of our statewide co-chairmen and is such a tremendous conservative leader here in the state of Iowa, standing for liberty, standing for the Constitution, standing for life and marriage and our constitutional rights. And I'm thrilled to be with you all. Let me say, Ralph, listening to Renee express her sentiments, as the father of daughters, I cannot imagine how proud you must be to hear your daughter saying that. I got to admit, my daughters, Caroline and Catherine, they're 4 and 7, and I think I could fairly say they would not express those sentiments. Indeed, I'm reminded of a couple of years ago when Caroline was 4 and I was running for the Senate. Caroline asked my wife Heidi, she said, is David Dewhurst, who was my opponent in the primary, she said, is he a bad man? Is he mean? And Heidi thought about it for a second. She said, no, he's a very good man. He's an honorable man. He has integrity. He served in the military. He served in the CIA. He's in an elected office. Caroline kind of furrows her brow for a minute. She looks up and says, well, if he's such a good guy, why would anyone vote for Daddy? And I have to admit, Heidi was stumped. She had no answer to that particular question. So I will say congratulations on this Father's Day for that tremendous affirmation. And I'll say it's great to be with so many friends. Last week I was in my hometown of Houston. Houston is where I grew up. Last week, the city of Houston, it was preparing for the onslaught of Tropical Storm Bill. Oddly enough, the Hillary campaign is doing the very same thing. These are extraordinary times. These are remarkable times. Our nation is in crisis. This isn't a typical election. I think this election's now or never. We're bankrupting this country. We're seeing our rights under assault from Washington like never before, and America has receded from leadership in the world. The entire world has gotten more dangerous. Today, our friends and allies, they don't trust us. Our enemies, they don't fear us. Now, there are many things we could talk about today. We could talk about the need to repeal every single word of Obamacare. We can talk about the need for fundamental tax reform, a simple flat tax where every American can fill out their taxes on a postcard, and we can abolish the IRS. We can talk about the need on day one, January 20th, 2017, for the next President of the United States to rescind every single unconstitutional and illegal executive action taken by President Obama. But I want to instead talk about something fundamental, and something fundamental to where we are here. This is an institution that is 115 days old. Did I get the number right? 115 days old. Happy 115th day anniversary. And it is devoted to the two most important amendments in the Bill of Rights. To the First Amendment and to the Second Amendment. This is an institution devoted to exercising the liberties that we have, and I would note, as David rightly pointed out, those rights, those liberties, they don't come from government. They weren't given to us by Washington. They come from God Almighty. Our nation was founded on a revolutionary principle. As the Declaration put it, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That they are endowed not by a king, not by a queen, and not by a president, but they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's how this country was founded. The Constitution, Thomas Jefferson explained, was designed to serve as chains to bind the mischief of government. Now, I'll tell you, I have spent virtually my entire adult life fighting to defend the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. When it comes to the First Amendment, there is a reason the very first protection in the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights is religious liberty. Because everything else is foundational. Everything else is built upon. And we have seen religious liberty under assault in the past few years at an unprecedented level. All of us, our hearts broke as we watched what happened in Indiana and Arkansas. As the legislatures there stood up to defend religious liberty, and what happened? The modern Democratic Party has become so extreme, has become so radical, that there is no room left in the Democratic Party for defending religious liberty. You know, a couple of decades ago, religious liberty was a bipartisan issue that brought us together. We might disagree, Republicans and Democrats, on marginal tax rates. But when it came to religious liberty, that brought everyone together. So, a couple of decades ago, when Congress passed the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it passed the United States Senate 97-3. It had the support of such famed right-wing nutcases as Ted Kennedy, Chuck Schumer, and Joe Biden. It was signed into law by a Democrat, Bill Clinton. That law is substantively identical to the laws that Indiana and Arkansas took up. Almost word for word. And yet today, the modern Democratic Party has decided their devotion to mandatory gay marriage in all 50 states is so unforgiving that there is no longer room for defending the religious liberty of Americans. You know, I'll tell a story of a couple I got to meet here in Iowa that I'm going to sit down and visit with later today, Dick and Betty Odgaard. It's a wonderful family that live on a farm, and on that farm is an historic church. And for years, their business was hosting weddings in that church, and they had a business catering, and that was their livelihood, was hosting weddings. Some years ago, two men came to the Odgaards and wanted to get married in their church. Now, the Odgaards are devout Mennonites. It was inconsistent with their faith to host a gay wedding. And so they declined. And they found themselves enmeshed in legal proceedings and persecution. Finally, they ended up having to write a check for $5,000 and to promise never again to host another wedding. So the Odgaards' livelihood has been taken away by this liberal fascism. This extreme view that if you hold a biblical teaching of marriage that is the union of one man and one woman, that the modern Democratic Party will persecute you and try to drive you out of civilized society. Now, when that fight was happening in Indiana, it was a perfect storm of Democrats and big business, and boy, big business has decided there's money in throwing overboard religious liberty. And sadly, more than a few Republicans ran for the hills, including more than a few candidates who are running for president in 2016. Some of them chose that exact moment to go rearrange their sock drawer. In my view, Indiana was a time for choosing. In my view, Indiana was, as William Barrett Travis in the Alamo said when he drew a line in the sand, it was a moment to choose on which side of the line you stand. You know, one of my favorite former senators from Texas is Senator Phil Gramm. He tells a story about how in the 1980s, he was a Democrat at the time. He was a conservative Democrat. He was working to round up support from other conservative Democrats for Ronald Reagan's tax cut. And he said other conservative Democrats were pressing back on him, and he said, look, and he drew the analogy, this is a line in the sand, this is the Alamo. And he said, one of those Blue Dog Democrats said, but Phil, everyone who stepped across that line died. And Phil responded with a twinkle in his eye, you're right. They did. And so did everyone who didn't step across that line. And nobody remembers their names. There are moments in life where if you stand for principle, you're remembered and it makes a difference. And if you run and hide, that gets remembered too. And I can tell you this, I will never, ever, ever shy from defending the religious liberty rights of every single American. Now, shifting to the second half of the famous saying, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. There is a reason the Second Amendment is right after the first. You know, I got to tell you, it's funny. When I was in law school, Conservative Law Journal made a coffee cup that was making fun. It was the liberals' Bill of Rights, and it listed the Bill of Rights, but when you poured hot coffee in it, some of them disappeared. The Second Amendment just disappeared altogether. The taking clause disappeared altogether. Free exercise of religion disappeared altogether. You know, let me address the Second Amendment this way. A few months ago, I was having a lunch here in Iowa with a number of conservative leaders. And one of them asked a question, said, Ted, why should we trust you? We've been burned so many times before. We're so fed up with politicians who blow smoke and don't tell the truth. Why should we trust you? And my response, I said, you know what? That is the most important question you can ask in this entire election cycle. And I'll tell you the truth of the matter is you shouldn't. Don't trust me or any other politician. Demand of every one of us, don't tell me, show me. And the example I used, I said, you know, when I was running for Senate in Texas, I traveled to hundreds of VFW halls and Denny's and IHOPs, meeting with grassroots activists, answering their questions. And I would point out, I said, look, any Republican candidate for office, they always have an issues page on their website, A, B, C, D, and E. And they list, word for word, the exact same position on every issue. Have you guys noticed this in the 2016 presidential election? That everyone will tell you, I am who-diddly the most conservative guy who ever lived. Now check me on this. You haven't yet seen a Republican presidential candidate stand in front of you and say, I am a spineless establishment monarch. And I stand for nothing. They don't say that. They all say they're super-duper conservative. Well, I used to point out when I was running for Senate that if you go to our webpage, tedcruz.org, 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 tedcruz.org. One of the first things people notice is that we don't have an issues page. Instead, we have a page that is labeled a proven record. What it says is for far too long, politicians have said one thing and done another. Every one of us should ask any candidate who shows up in front of us, you say you believe these principles. Show me. When have you stood up and fought for them? When have you bled for them? And what have you accomplished? As the scripture says, you shall know them by their fruits. And what it then said is for the past decade, Ted has been fighting for conservative principles over and over again and winning on a national level. Colon. And what followed was 3 pages of bullet points. Now, the example I used to illustrate it was the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment, there is a right answer in the state of Texas. I support the Second Amendment. Unless you are clinically insane. Heck, even Democrats in Texas claim they support the Second Amendment. Now, you know, I used to point out, if you went to our webpage, tedcruz.org, I actually didn't say I supported the Second Amendment. Didn't say a word about what was hidden in the deep recesses of my heart. What I did say is that when I was the Solicitor General of Texas, the chief lawyer for the state of Texas in front of the United States Supreme Court, that I led a coalition of 31 states in front of the Supreme Court defending the individual right to keep and bear arms, and we won a landmark 5-4 victory upholding that fundamental right. And then it linked to the 2010 NRA's Carter Knight Freedom Fund Award, awarded every year to one of the leading defenders in the country of the Second Amendment. That's the difference between talk and action. In 2016, every Republican candidate says they support the Second Amendment. The question we need to ask is, great, where were you when President Obama and Harry Reid pushed their gun control agenda to take away the right to keep and bear arms of law-abiding citizens? Did you stand up and report to duty? Did you cross that line and say, I will defend our liberties? Or did you choose that moment to go do something else? You know, I had a former boss of mine who used to say, if I'm ever accused of being a Christian, I'd like for there to be enough evidence to convict me. Now, look, I think that is powerfully true, but it is equally true of being a conservative. If you're really a conservative, you shouldn't have to tell anybody, because you will have been in the foxholes. You will bear the stripes. When you stand for conservative principles, the Democrats vilify you. The media vilifies you. Even Republicans vilify you. Look, if I stood up tomorrow and decided I'm going to run as the moderate in this race, I couldn't do it. If Ralph stood up tomorrow and said he's going to run as the moderate, Ralph couldn't do it. Because when you walk the walk, it's apparent to everyone. Let me make a final point. For all of us, when we think of liberty, it's not an abstract concept. It's not something we read in our junior high textbooks. It's personal. It's real. And it comes from our families. It comes from our family stories. For me, it resonates most powerfully in my father's story. My dad was born in Cuba. He grew up in Cuba, and when he was a teenager, he fought in the Cuban Revolution. He was imprisoned. He was tortured as a teenager. When he was 17 years old, as he was in that dark and dank prison cell that reeked of blood and urine, he didn't know if he'd live or die. He tells me today that he thought at the time, it doesn't matter if I die. I don't have kids. I don't have a family that depends on me. What difference does my life make? But thankfully, God had a different plan for my father's life. He was released from that prison cell and he fled Cuba. And he came to America. In 1957, he arrived in the United States. He was 18 and he couldn't speak a word of English. He had $100 that was sewn into his underwear. And his first job was washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. And he worked 7 days a week. He paid his way through school. He went on to start a small business. Today, my dad is a pastor based out of Dallas. Now, my whole life, my father has been my hero. Many of you may have gotten to meet him. He spent a lot of time up here in Iowa, and he's going to continue to spend a lot of time up here in Iowa. But you know what I find most incredible about my father's story? How commonplace it is. Every one of us, we've got a story just like that in our backgrounds. Some of us, it's us. Others, it's our parents. Others, it's our great-great-great-grandparents. But what ties Americans together is we are the children of those who risked everything for freedom. And I think that's the fundamental DNA of what it means to be an American, to value liberty and opportunity above all else. It's why I'm so optimistic. The American people are rising up because these are our values. America remains a center-right country. We remain a country built on Judeo-Christian values. And I'll tell you the reason each of us is gathered here today. It's what my father used to say to me when I was a little boy. My dad used to say to me over and over again, when we faced oppression in Cuba, I had a place to flee to. If we lose our freedom here, where do we go? That's why we're here. That's why we're standing up, and I am incredibly optimistic and encouraged by the men and women here. Courageous conservatives across Iowa and across this country that are waking up, that are standing up to get back to the free market principles and constitutional liberties that have made America great. I'm here asking for your support, for your help. We're building a grassroots army, and together we're going to reclaim that shining city on a hill. That last best hope of mankind that is the United States of America. Thank you.